My name is Dante Gagne. I'm the Senior Accessibility Product Manager for Visual Studio. Been here for a little over 20 years. I was originally one of the testers on Blend. Most of my career has been in UI, and about eight and a half years ago, after Satya took over as CEO, one of the first questions he asked was, how accessible are we? He really wanted to make sure that we increased our investment in accessibility. And while some products like Office really had a good idea, DevDiv, our accessibility program, was not the best. So I was among the folks who were tasked to answer that question of how accessible are we and what do we need to do to become an accessible product. And when I started talking to the leadership, the leadership over in DevDiv, the question I kept getting asked was, why do we care? Why is it important? Yes, there's legal reasons. Yes, Satya is asking us, but when we've got this long list of features that we're trying to work on, why should we be prioritizing accessibility? So the reason why I want to put together this talk, the reason why I'm kind of chatting with you here today is to kind of talk a little bit about why accessibility is important, kind of start giving you all some of the insights that I've developed over my time with Visual Studio that you might be able to take back to your companies and help understand why accessibility is important, and then talk about a few of the things that we've been doing in Visual Studio to help make developing accessible applications a little bit easier, and definitely leave some time at the end with some Q&A. So we're going to start with some terms. If you've been doing accessibility for a while, this will be a review, but I do want to make sure we're all speaking the same language. We're going to talk about some of those benefits because there really are there's a lot of value in doing accessible software other than just, the standard ones. And a few tips that I've used to help those teams who, I don't like to use the word stubborn, but when you've got teams with a lot of priorities, it is useful to help them understand the value that comes from this and some of the tips that I've used to help teams recognize the value. There are some things that you can do that are low cost that help you get rolling. And there will be it's not a very long demo, but there are some tools that we've been adding to Visual Studio that's been a start of a journey to help developers start making accessible applications, because our belief is that if we can make the tools easy to use and easy to incorporate into your inner loop, it's just going to make it that much easier to start getting those muscles built up, and you're going to be able to start seeing the benefits of accessible workflow. So let's go ahead and start with the terms. And again, this is just to make sure we're all speaking the same language and help you as you start getting into accessible development workflow, make sure that these terms don't come as, what are we talking about here? So the first one's accessible, compliant, and usable. You're going to see quite a bit. And accessible simply means that your tool can be used by people with disabilities. They may use the technologies when they're using your tool, and assistive technologies are things like screen readers, magnifier, speech recognition software. Some of these are built into Windows. Some of them are ones that they're going to bring from outside. But assistive technologies are simply the tools that people use to be able to normalize their own abilities versus the abilities that your software was originally designed for. Now, for instance, you've probably developed your software and everything is printed up on a screen that's displayed to the user. A screen reader, all that does is it takes the displayed text on the screen and it reads it out to a user who can't visually see it. If folks have used any kind, as folks get used to working with accessibility, these assistive technologies simply normalize the playing field so that as people have disabilities, it allows everybody to use your software. Accessibility simply means that your software honors the contracts that these assistive technologies are based on. Now, every platform has got their own contracts. If you're working with desktop applications, you're probably working with the UI automation tree. If you're working with web, you're probably working with the HTML like ARIA and things like that. Every platform is going to have their own contracts. I'm a desktop accessibility expert, so I can talk at length, far more than you probably want me to, about how the UI automation tree works. But each platform that you're working on is going to have its own techniques. And later on, when I get to the demo, I'll be able to show you how .NET MAUI does some of their automation and how, as long as you meet those contracts, everything is going to be connected. There's a difference between accessible and compliant. Accessible is kind of the umbrella term. Compliant is a very specific and more of a legal term, which says that your product meets the objective terms set out by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. Compliant meets the legal requirements. WCAG, WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are a set of objective terms that have been set up by a standards body that stipulates what it means to be accessible. So if you've got black text on a white background, that is, quote, easy for anybody to read. If you've got dark blue text on a black background, that is more difficult. And these guidelines establish mathematical formulas and everything that make it easier for everybody to, or establish what is reasonably easy for people to read. If you meet these guidelines, you are called compliant. And this means that based on Section 508 laws in the United States, EN 301 laws in the European Union, and all of the different legal laws worldwide, if you're compliant, then you're not going to, and I use that term in quotes, not going to run afoul of those laws in the various countries. There are legal laws and you really don't want to run afoul of those, but I'm not here to give legal advice. I definitely encourage you to take a look at the laws in your various countries. But compliant is a legal term that you want to make sure that you're adhering to wherever you are. All of these, accessible, compliant, those are important and you want to make sure that you're meeting those, but it is possible to be compliant and have a complete pile of garbage for your users. I'll give you an example. In the United States, we have laws that say that if you have a business, you need to have a wheelchair ramp, and that wheelchair ramp must be a certain slope. Because if you have a wheelchair ramp that has a 60-degree slope, nobody in a wheelchair could get up that. It's way too steep. Well, I could have a wheelchair ramp and it could be narrow, it could be shallow enough that somebody could get up it. But if that wheelchair ramp wraps all the way around the building and you have to go to the back and you have to go through a narrow alley with a few lights on it, sure, I'm meeting the requirements. I'm doing what the law says I have to do, but if somebody needed to use that ramp, it certainly wouldn't be a very welcoming experience to me. It certainly wouldn't be one that I'd be eager to say, yes, that's a company that cares about me and my needs. Actually, I'd probably go find somebody else that makes me feel like I'm very welcome. And before you sit there and say, no, nobody would do that, there's actually, I remember seeing a convenience store in Kona, Hawaii that did exactly that. The wheelchair ramp wraps all the way around the building and there are exactly 2 lights down the hallway for anybody who needs that wheelchair ramp. That's the alley that they have to go through. And honestly, if I were a wheelchair user, that's not an experience that I'd want to have. And similarly, if I'm working on software, that's not the experience I'd want my users with disabilities to have. So when we're talking about accessible and compliant, sure, it's important to be accessible. If you're not accessible, users with disabilities can't use your software at all. If you're not compliant, you've got gaps that certain people with disabilities just can't use your product. But you want to make sure you're usable as well. You want to make sure that users with disabilities feel comfortable. You want to feel like they're efficient when you're using your software. And I know I'm going to come off here sounding a little bit like you should and so on, but these are terms that when Visual Studio started our journey, we really didn't even think about usable. We really only had laser focus on we need to make sure we're compliant. And let me give you an example of how that manifested for us. So one of the first panels we started with was the debugger window. We had a blind developer come in and we asked that developer, show us how you debug your application in Visual Studio. And he brought up his application and the first thing he did was he littered the code with console.writeline. Tons of print, and the first thing our debugger team said was, are you using the locals window? So the whole window is inaccessible. None of the controls, I can't get to any of them. None of them have got any of the properties that I need for my screen reader to give me any of the information. So the entire window is inaccessible. We didn't even have the first step. Okay, so engineers went off. They cracked open the UI automation specification. They went through, they understood, okay, these are the requirements. And what you see up top there with the accessible is what the screen reader started spitting out as soon as keyboard focus went into the window. So what the screen reader does is as keyboard focus moves around, it arrives at a control and the UI automation tree creates what's called an automation peer, which is an abstraction of the given control. And among the properties that it has is a name property that describes the properties of the control. In this case, for row, it specifies what does the user need to know. And it specified
the variable with name, because, okay, I've got a row in a table. The variable with name, path, has value, quote, C:\\, it read off all of that. You can see that's what it spit out when the focus arrived on each row. And our engineers clapped great job. The engineers clapped their hands and said, hey, great, we met accessible. And we did. That is accessible. That met all the requirements. It ticked all the boxes, and yes, it did its job. We put that in front of the engineer, the blind engineer who was helping us, and he just shook his head and said, oh God, no. And what's wrong? And he says, let me show you. He put the focus on the top row. He goes, the variable with name, and then he hit the down arrow. The variable with name, the variable with name, the variable with name. He says, I have to sit through all of that. I'm just looking for the handle row. And I got to sit through the variable with name every time. When you're a sighted user and you're trying to scan this, do your eyes go down here and then jump back up to the top and then go down, then jump back up to the top? You don't. When you're using this, you know where you are. You don't need to recheck that every time. So that I don't need that told to me every time. So what we ended up doing, and this is what the locals window does now, path, string, quote, C:, FS, system IO file string, can read, bool, true. And now when he hits that down arrow, what he hears is path, FS, can read, can see, can timeout, can write, handle, that's what I'm looking for. And now he gets his information. This is usable. This is what we needed. And the big difference here is that at this point, we didn't get that insight until we put the experience in front of a blind developer, somebody who was going to use this on a frequent basis. He then was able to say, this is how I'm going to use this control. This is what my experience actually is. And he was able to give us that feedback. This brings us to the other two terms I definitely want to talk about, and this is the difference between accessible application development versus inclusive application development. Now, accessible application development is making sure that your application is accessible. This is having programs in place with your company to make sure that you're checking for accessibility, that you have tests in place, that you have cadence in what it is to make sure that you're meeting those guidelines. Where inclusive application development is making sure that you are including persons with disabilities in your design and development process. So with Visual Studio, we are always taking our experiences and working with people with disabilities and saying, hey, this is what we did. Give this a try. Tell us what you think. I spend a fair amount of time with a mailing list for blind developers and showing them the experiences and collecting that feedback to make sure that the solutions for our problems are what they're actually asking for. And that is practicing inclusive application development. And that is what I want to encourage folks to go for. But that's not to say that the top isn't worth striving for. Making sure that your application is accessible is a great goal by itself. And even just that step is worth shooting for, because if you're not even going that far, you've got users who aren't able to use your software at all. So I encourage folks that if you're only able to do one, absolutely go for the accessibility. But as you go on that journey and as you develop, don't stop there. Make sure that if you have the opportunity, bring more folks into the process and help them get that feedback. So again, these are the terms. You're going to see these as you start going on the journey. You're going to be able to hear more people talking about them. Think about ways that you can incorporate these in. They are really valuable and they will pay dividends. And that's the next thing I want to talk about is, why should you be doing all of this? What are the benefits? Now, of course, there are the legal implications. I can sit up here and talk about the lawsuits that have been filed against companies. I can talk about the new laws in the European Union that say if you have consumer-facing software and you're not accessible, you can get your product yanked off the shelf, carte blanche. We can talk about that all day. Honestly, it's kind of boring because it's just, you legally have to, end of story, and that's all anybody thinks about it. That doesn't really motivate anybody. Okay, maybe it motivates accountants and lawyers and things like that, but I don't really want to talk about that. I do want to talk about the other ones, the broader audience. I had a test manager one time say, you've just filed an accessibility bug on me that impacts 1/100% of our audience. and I've got other bugs that are impacting 99%. Why should I prioritize these? We did a survey of Visual Studio developers, and we asked them to self-identify, do you have a disability of one kind or another? Because we actually didn't know how many of our developers have various disabilities. So we asked folks, we have no way to specifically tell through telemetry or anything like that. And frankly, it would be a terrible invasion of privacy, even if we could, to say, oh, look, there's somebody with a disability. That'd be horrible. And certainly we wouldn't do that. But we asked folks, are you comfortable disclosing a disability? We found that between 1% and 2% of our developers identify as having a visual disability. Now, okay, I have a visual disability. I wear glasses, but just under 1% of our developers use a screen reader. It's actually, I think it was about 0.8%. So we're not talking, a thousandth of a percent. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 out of 150. That's not nearly as small a number as we thought it was going to be. The percentage of people with a motor disability or a disability that affects their hands is over 1%. The number of folks, according to the World Health Organization, 1 in 10 people have a disability of one kind or another. And if you're talking to your marketing folks and you tell them, if we don't care about accessibility, we have the potential of taking 10% of the people out there and telling them we don't care about them, your marketing folks are going to sit there and go, really? You really do have an impact on your audience when you say you don't care about accessibility. And more than that, if you are the product that can be used by blind developers and your competition can't, then your blind developers are going to come to you. They're not going to go to your competition if they simply can't be used. It reduces the number of choices available. And when you find out that it isn't as hard as you might think to make your product accessible to blind users, to users with motor disabilities, and so on, you may find it's absolutely worth that effort to put in to be able to reach that broader audience. Thirdly, it actually makes a better product. And let me explain to you, let me give you a couple examples of that one. One of the first accessibility projects that I worked on, Blend was originally designed as a product to try to reach users who worked on Photoshop. We were trying to reach the designers, not the developers, and Photoshop users love their mouse. They don't want to use a keyboard. So the entire property panel was, there was no keyboard model for it. We actually expected people to use their keyboard as little as possible. And then we were told, no, you got to be accessible. You can't be released without a keyboard model. So that was what I started working on. And we wanted it to be as effective as possible. So we did a great keyboard model. We made it as efficient as we could. We made it so that you could tab through it very fast. You didn't tab to the little property markers. We made it as smooth as we could. As soon as we released that, our power users, the developers who hate using the mouse, flooded us with positive feedback. They absolutely loved it. So even though what we were doing was meeting an accessibility requirement, which frankly, we didn't really think there were a lot of blind developers doing UI development, which actually we found out there are more of them than you think, which has always kind of surprised me, but I'm actually very happy about that. We were going for an accessibility requirement, but the people who were our power users absolutely loved it. And we made the product better for it. Another company that has asked to remain anonymous, they had a series of screens in their product that was used across the entire company. They worked on a project where they had a handful of their employees who identified as neurodivergent, specifically on the autistic spectrum. They brought them in, and these are folks who are very sensitive to cognitive load. If there's too much information on the screen, information they didn't need at that time, too complicated or anything like that, they would let them know, hey, I'm getting overwhelmed. There's too much here. So they optimized that workflow for those developers who were sensitive to overly complicated or too much information on the screen. And they iterated on those workflows, brought everything down. And at the end of it, those users said, yeah, this is actually a great workflow. I'm a lot more efficient with this. They rolled that out and did, of course, measured and studied. And they found that the average savings in time across the entire company was between 800 and 1200 milliseconds per user across the company. When you consider how many employees they have, how many times those screens went through, and the impact of that, that worked out to hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings per week across the company. So what they did was they improved the workflow, focusing on the neurodivergent users who were sensitive to cognitive load and data overload, and it resulted in a better product that saved their company millions. These are just a couple examples where focusing on accessibility and focusing on a more inclusive and accessible product resulted in a better product overall. There are many other examples of this I could cite in Visual Studio and other products across DevDiv and CNAI where this kind of accessible work has resulted in a better product, and I encourage you to take a look at this in your products as well. And lastly, advocacy. For Visual Studio in particular, when we started out, it turns out Visual Studio was actually one of the better products for accessibility. A lot of the fact that many of our parts were built on WPF, and WPF actually does some things fairly well for accessibility, Visual Studio actually did a lot of things pretty well for accessibility. And a lot of our community already felt that we were one of the better products. But as we've been working on it, our community champions us. And if you look at Twitter, particularly I don't necessarily encourage people to look at Twitter right now, but we won't get into that. If you look in the communities for people with disabilities, they will frequently call out products who work on accessibility as, yeah, this is who you want to use. If your product spends time working on accessibility, the people who you are serving will be your champions in their respective communities. And if you've got users today who, I certainly wouldn't hope this happens to anybody, but if they develop an accessible need, they will cheer for you. We had a developer who was in an auto accident and was going to have his wrist in a sling for 4 weeks. He started using the speech control tools in Windows and started going to Twitter and talking about how great it was that Visual Studio did a pretty good job working with those voice control tools in Windows. And that was all because of the work we had done to work with the UI automation stack. He was talking about how great it was that when he needed Visual Studio to do the things for him, we were there for him. All of these people will be champions for your product, and we have found they will talk about your product. They will cheer for you when you're there for them. And while that sounds a little bit, self-serving and so on, it actually isn't. It's just a mutual relationship where when you're there for them, they'll be there for you. Yeah. So that's a great question. The question was, what about developers who are developing carpal tunnel syndrome, repetitive stress injuries, and things like that? And that's it's a very Visual Studio specific point, and that's something that we're seeing. For VS in particular, Stack Overflow releases a survey every year, giving the demographics of developers, and the average age of developers is going up faster than 1 per year. So developers are getting older, and we're seeing carpal tunnel in particular. That's one, the idea of speech coding is one that we're doing a lot of research into right now. And the rise of AI Copilot is one that we're really looking into because, let me give a specific one. If you take a look at the Ability Summit this year, there's a developer by the name of Anna White who she gave a presentation. Anna has only one hand, and she gave a presentation about how some of the AI coding tools in Visual Studio, like IntelliCode, helps her type quite a bit less. In her case, literally, she feels she only has a certain number of keystrokes that she can do every day because as she uses speech coding, she developed problems where the amount of speaking she does every day eventually tires out her voice and causes those problems. So it cascades. If you type so much with your hand, then you start going to speech, and then you're talking so much over the day, your throat gets worn out. The more we can reduce the amount of work you can do with your body overall, the more you can go do fun stuff afterwards. So absolutely, that's where, I mean, we're working in AI assisted coding for a wide range of reasons, but absolutely repetitive stress injury, carpal tunnel. The more we can get you, the core problem is how do we get the code from your brain onto the screen as quickly as we can? If we can reduce that, we want to. I've been playing with trying to find ways to use speech to drive GitHub Copilot, and I really want to see us do more in that space as well. But there's absolutely that is an area that needs more, I think needs more investigation, and we'll see how that goes. But I think it's a great question. Thank you. So I hope this gives you an idea that it's not just legal. It's not just, when Satya said, I want to know how accessible we were, we didn't just want to do it to be able to put on the marketing sheets, yes, we're an accessible product. Yes, we comply. And yes, Visual Studio is sold in schools. Yes, we are sold to the government, and these are requirements that we need to meet. But the value that we've seen has been far greater than that. People ask me why I'm passionate about accessibility personally. When I started this journey, I spoke to a blind developer, and he told me that one of the reasons why he has a job at all is because Visual Studio is accessible as it is. If Visual Studio stopped being accessible, he wouldn't be able to work where he is, and he wouldn't be able to have the job that he does. And for me personally, that is what really got me hooked on accessibility, because it really meant a difference. Yeah. So the question was, does VS Code have the same features? Every product at Microsoft is required to go through a accessibility program and be deemed compliant. We're actually quite proud that Visual Studio Code is not just compliant, but they recently went through a usability study, and they actually reached a slightly higher bar of usability than even Visual Studio has. So yes, they don't just have the same level, but they went through a whole usability study to show that they're even at a higher bar than VS is. So yes, their quality of accessibility is even higher. So we're very proud of VS Code in particular. So both Visual Studio and VS Code strive to be as high as they can be. Both products really spend a lot of time with the community, trying to listen and spend time to be as good as we can possibly be. So yes. Yeah. Yeah, the comment was that it's very important for blind screen reader users to get that information. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. So I'm hoping by now I've given the impression that yes, this is important, but if you've got the idea, now how do you go back to an engineering manager who has a team of a bunch of people, a list of priorities and all these things? How do you get them to kind of agree with it? Well, first off, explaining the advantages, for some folks that can be enough. Well, what are some other ideas? Well, there are some small things, we'll talk about those in a minute, that you can start doing, and some of those small things can be enough that, here are the nuts and bolts, and this is what we're seeing, this is what our customers are telling us, here's what we can do, and let me show you what the impact of that is. You can also take a look at your reported issues. When we started, so shouldn't come as a surprise, I really hope it isn't, because if it is, I'm really in trouble. We have a large customer database of feedback that we get from our customers that we review very regularly. I mean, as a product manager, I spend hours every week going through the feedback from our customers. Are your customers already telling you you've got issues? Take a look in there for hard to read. Take a look in there for screen readers. Take a look in there for high contrast and things like that. You may already be getting feedback from your users saying that they're having a hard time using their existing assistive technologies. How much of that are you getting? If you're not getting anything, that may be a problem of its own, because if you've got users with disabilities and you're not getting that feedback, they may be trying you once, saying, no, this isn't an accessible product, and they're just going away. That could be even worse. So take a look at your feedback and get an idea of how much feedback you're getting. Honestly, your ideal, if you haven't been looking at this right now, is a little bit of feedback. That means you've got some smaller problems, some addressable problems. If you're not getting any at all, that might be an issue of its own. Another one is do a demo with your ATs. Like I said, one of the things that really motivated our engineers was having a blind developer come in and show what it was like to try to use the debugger. Having engineers who had been working 8, 9 months, a year and a half on the locals window, and having a blind developer come in and go, I can't use it. I don't even know how it works because the whole thing's inaccessible. It was a punch to the gut to them. It was their baby, and as far as the blind developer was concerned, it didn't exist. Try navigating your app with just the keyboard. How easy is that to do? Try turning on narrator and see how it describes things. You may be in for a bit of a surprise. This was one thing I did. So we had a bug in the welcome screen. I don't want to get into love it or hate it on a welcome screen. Some people love it, some people really don't. But there was a bug at one point that all of the buttons on the welcome screen didn't have their automation name properly set. So this is what the welcome screen looked like to anybody with a screen reader. Every button was just button. If you had this dialogue for the first time, how would you have any clue at all how to use it? But this is what a screen reader experience was like. Button, button, button. This was for as many years as I've been working at Visual Studio, one of the only times we ever did a servicing release for a preview. Because when we saw this bug come in, the triage team looked at it and said, if this was what got out for a standard release for everybody, we would have recalled the preview. We would have pulled it off and said, no, nobody can have this. We can't let this out. And when we realized that this was the experience that some of our users with disabilities had, we triaged it the same way. And that's how we triage our accessibility related bugs. Treat it as though that experience was in the hands of every single one of our developers. And if every developer had a bug like this, we needed to fix it. We turned around a servicing fix for this one within 24 hours. This, when my managers and the leadership of Visual Studio saw it, said, no, we got to fix that. And this is what helped build that empathy for folks when they realized this is the experience that screen reader users had. This helped people start to turn that corner. And they said, wait. And yeah, I had to convince them. I had to help them realize. And it wasn't until I brought up narrator and tabbed around and I moved focus over to the buttons, and what they heard was button, button, button. It's like, okay, no, this is not good, and we fixed it. So this is one of those tools, and especially when the UX designer who had worked and spent all the hours on this panel heard it described that way, they were livid. These are the kinds of things that have made, I can't necessarily promise it's going to work for your team, but on my team, this kind of empathy really drove home for teams, yeah, these are things that we can't let stand. And these are things that help build that empathy and build a little bit more desire from teams to be able to start investing in accessibility. So how do you get started? I mentioned before, sometimes it is the way to get people bought in is to make some small changes and show teams that it's having some impact. So a few things that you can do. I mean, obviously getting familiar with some assistive technologies is very valuable. Can you use your software without a mouse? As I mentioned before, turn on narrator and just listen to your software. There is also a tool out there, I think it's called Narrator Buddy or something like that. Instead of listening to narrator, it will put whatever narrator is about to say into a list box so you can read what it says. Because I will tell you, if you have open floor plans like we have at Microsoft, you will drive everybody in your room nuts listening to narrator. And quite frankly, as somebody who's not used to narrator, I can't listen to narrator for very long, but it is actually easier sometimes to have the narrator buddy open so you can read along with each line to see exactly what it says. Just listen to what it says. And you'll find that it will say, checkbox selected, button enabled, and you'll see all the text, and you'll get an idea of what your blind users have, what their experience is like. Now, I also encourage you to do a little bit of reading about how screen readers work. For instance, Screen readers have a second cursor. So as you know, if you're navigating around a typical application, the tab key will only move through interactive controls. It won't move to labels, headers, and things like that. Screen readers actually have a second cursor that they can use to move around to the labels. So if you're on a text box, you can hit caps lock left arrow and it will move to the non-interactive control so they can figure out what labels associated with it. So don't immediately assume, hey, I'm just tabbed around and I don't know what this control is. A screen reader user has actually got additional controls that they can use. It's worth having a subject matter expert on your team if you don't have a blind developer on your team. Having somebody who's gone through and understands how screen readers work, because that having that understanding is going to help your team out immeasurably. But at least turning it on, and if you're working on Windows, you've got it available. And again, if you're doing phone development, you've got screen narration on your phone. If you're working with web, Narrator will be able to do narration of your web clients. All of these are available, and all of them are built into whatever platform you're working on. VoiceOver on the Mac, it's all there. It's all built into whatever operating system you're working on. Fire it up, give it a try. You can always take a look at the WCAG standard. I don't encourage this if you're not ready to get into what is the equivalent of one of the largest sets of stereo instructions you've ever looked at, because it is a challenging read. However, I will say I have gone through the WCAG standard, at least as far as the part that has to do with software, and it has opened my eyes up to disabilities I had never really thought about. For instance, there are WCAG standards talking about how quickly or slowly something is allowed to blink, because that is all in there to protect people who have photosensitivity to seizures. That's something we had never really thought about, but all of that is in there. There are things in there that talk about focus visuals and how many pixels are allowed to be dotted, because if you have too much space between dots, it's hard for somebody who has a visual impairment to notice it, because if your eyes can't focus well enough, you're not going to be able to see the space between the dots and things like that. But the WCAG standard is not universal. One anecdote I actually found fairly interesting that I only learned about a little over a year ago is there's a minimum color contrast ratio. Color contrast ratio, as I said, is black text on white background is the best color contrast ratio. Light yellow on white is one of the worst. However, there is a condition called Irlen syndrome where if the color contrast ratio is too high, the letters actually look like they kind of shake on the screen, which can be difficult for people to read. This is something I only heard about recently. So you actually, the ideal there is allow people to configure the colors. So this is why the WCAG standard doesn't say you, it actually has rules in there allowing people to customize the colors, because there is no one size fits all. You need to allow people to pick the colors that are more suitable for them, and or allow the color settings in the operating system to come through. Going through the WCAG guidelines, they're a basis, but again, as we talked about before, compliance is not the same as usability. You can have a fully compliant application, but it's not going to be as good as one that you've had users with disabilities using your software. Of course, that third point, talk to customers with disabilities. If you have users out there with disabilities, talk to them. If you see people giving feedback in your channels talking about, I'm having a hard time with my screen reader, I'm having a hard time reading it because the text is so hard, see if you can reach out to those users. And if you find out that they are screen reader users, find out if they're willing to share their experiences with you. If they've already disclosed through your user channels that they are screen reader users, odds are they're already looking to help with your experience. They might be very eager to talk to you and share what their experience is. Take advantage of that one, because if they're already showing that eagerness, talk to them. The worst they can do is say, no, they don't want to talk, but if they're willing to share, you can get a lot of value from it. And that's how we have found a lot of people to talk to over the years. Lastly, check out your software with Accessibility Insights and the Integrated Accessibility Checker in Visual Studio. These are tools that can help you determine whether or not your product is accessible. And for those folks who have been patiently waiting for me to show off a little bit of VS, well, that's where we are right now. So accessibility insights, let me go ahead and tab over here. Let me go ahead and bring this over. So accessibility insights, let me go ahead and show this off. So I'm going to bring up so this is a .NET MAUI application. I'm going to go ahead and play this over here. This is an extremely simple application, but the goal here is to kind of show the concept. And accessibility insights, let me go ahead and bring this up real quick. Here it is, and it's going to complain to me that I don't have the latest version, which it always does because they update it very, very frequently. There are multiple versions of accessibility insights. Are you seriously not going to open for me? Every now and then Accessibility Insights says, no, you must update the latest version, so I apologize. This will just take a moment. Accessibility Insights, there are separate versions of it for Windows, which is the one that is updating right now. There is a version that is a plugin for your web browser. There is a version that works for Android and so on. And what these do is it scans your application for the WCAG violations that can be programmatically detected. Now, note there are accessibility rules that cannot be programmatically detected. So for instance, tab order. Tab order is something that we have yet to figure out a way to programmatically detect. So Accessibility Insights is not going to help you with that one. That's one you're going to need manual testing for. But anything that we can currently detect, Accessibility Insights will do that for you. And as soon as it finishes updating, we'll just give it a moment there. So the nice thing about Accessibility Insights is it detects the biggest issues that will get in the way of your users. Most notably, it will detect if you've got a control that's missing a name property. These are the ones that will cause your button to just be button. It will detect if you've got multiple controls that are next to each other with the same name. So if you've got two buttons that both say address, to a screen reader user, I've got one control over here that says address, I've got another control over here that says address, I don't know which one I'm supposed to use. Accessibility Insights will detect that for you. An error, are you seriously complaining? Okay, well, Accessibility Insights has decided to betray me today, and I will go yell at the PM for that later. So I won't be able to demo that one right now, but I will show right now. It is fairly easy to find. It is simply Accessibility Insights, accessibilityinsights.io. And this is the web page. And there is a browser for web, there is a browser for Windows, and you can download it from here. I probably would be able to get it faster if I just download it fresh, but this will give you an application that will scan you can point it at a given page of your application and it will show you the issues that you have. Now, if you, however, are running in Visual Studio, one of the pieces of feedback that we've gotten from our users is the more that we can keep you inside Visual Studio, the better. So we have integrated the Accessibility Insights into Visual Studio. So I clicked the button. Let me bring that back up so you can see where it is. But there is a small accessibility button here in the live toolbar inside Visual Studio. So when my application is running, I just click that button. And here in Visual Studio, it is now showing me the controls that have got accessibility issues that it detected. So when I click on one of these, inside the application, it's going to show me a red box that tells me which control has got the accessibility issue. And in this case, it's telling me that the name property for this particular control has got Unicode characters in it. So when the screen reader finds this particular control, it's going to have an issue and go, I don't know how to fix this control. Or the screen reader is going to have a problem trying to read this out to the user. So I'm just going to double click on this row, and this is going to take me to this particular element. And I am going to try to remember the property off the top of my head, which is, of course, not coming to me at the moment. It is semantic properties. I knew that one. Semantic properties dot description. And this is the breed. So I'm going to add that in. I'm going to save my code. And thanks to hot reload in Maui applications, I'm going to scan for automation properties, and that just disappears off the list. So before that issue was there, if I was running a screen reader and focus arrived at that control, the screen reader is going to say something odd. What exactly it does is going to vary from screen reader to screen reader. It's possible the screen reader would work just fine. JAWS or NVDA, they might be able to know what that particular Unicode character is. It might not. If it's one of the less popular screen reader users, it might give some garbage to the user. It might say, let's see, the Unicode text for that particular element is, it's a little bit further down. Where was it? I don't remember where it is off the top of my head, but it might read the the Unicode individual characters or something like that, which would be rather confusing to the screen reader. It's going to depend on the screen reader, how it would handle it, but either way, to the user, it's going to give them some garbage information that they're really not going to have, they're not going to find value from. But by providing the semantic properties description, that's how .NET MAUI actually would give the proper information to the screen reader. Now my screen reader user is going to get a better experience. So what the engine gave me is, hey, this could cause a problem for your screen reader user. I was able to double click on it here in Visual Studio. It took me to where the code was. I updated it, and then when I rescanned, it came out of it. This allowed me to fix one of the problems that one of my blind users would be able to have. If you go through this tool, this is going to be able to fix many of the problems that your blind users, many of the more egregious problems that your blind users are going to be able to have. And if you remember that discussion that we had at the beginning about the benefits, this can actually take care of a lot of the worst problems that your blind users are going to run into. Now, it's not going to fix everything, but this also, if I had a motor disability, the motor disability actually is one of the ones that would be an issue. If I had a motor disability, before I made this fix, I wouldn't be able to say, click breed. A motor disability, the Dragon Naturally Speaking, for instance, click is a keyword. And what's going to happen behind the scenes is click, Dragon says, okay, the user is trying to invoke a control. They just said breed. I'm now going to scan the visual tree and look for a control whose name is breed. Well, here's one that's some Unicode garbage and then breed. I'm not sure this is the right one, and it may skip over it. Dragon might be smart enough to pick up on that, but not every speech recognition software might be able to. They may not be able to click on that button. But now that I gave it a semantic property description of breed, any speech recognition software is going to recognize that this is the breed button. And when the user said click breed, it will click that button. It will have the correct association between them. So actually, for the motor disability, this is a much better solution. So these are the kinds of things that fixing these issues here with the accessibility checker, those are going to overcome some of those problems and just give a better experience to your users with disabilities. And this process down here, now granted, yes, I happen to know with the semantic properties description that that's the fix for this particular bug. Solving these issues, in my case, I happen to know them. One of the things that we are looking into is better fixers for these, more automated fixers. And this is something that right now we're looking for people who are using these tools, and we're looking for telemetry on these to see if people are using these, if people are finding them useful. This is a fairly new feature. This one, it just went into the preview channel for Visual Studio. I think it was 17.4. So this is a fairly new feature, and we're looking for people to use them and to give us the feedback on, yeah, this is useful for us. We're finding value in it. Yeah. It is not available on Visual Studio for Mac yet right now, primarily because we're relying on the UI automation tree, which is not available on VS for Mac yet. But this is available for Visual Studio for Windows right now. But we want people to give this a try. And we are hoping that as folks are working with this, let us know ways that we can improve on it. We want to make this better and we want to give it more value. Yeah. Does this work for HTML? There are separate tools for doing accessibility testing for HTML. I'm not an expert on those ones, but there are other tools for it. I don't have that with me right now, but I believe they are. Reach out, chat with me after the meeting. I'll get my contact information. I believe there are some tools. Again, I'm a desktop expert, but I believe there are some built-in tools for working with accessibility for HTML. I just don't know where they are as well. There's another question back here. Is there automation ID for Maui? I'm sorry. You know what? Why don't I give you? Unfortunately, one of my disabilities is my hearing is not so great, but is there an automation ID property for Maui? The equivalent is semantic properties .description. That's the equivalent to automation ID .name. So they took a handful of the automation ID properties from WPF and changed a few of them to make them more generic across the different platforms that Maui serves. The problem was because the properties were identical between Maui and WPF, it caused some problems when it was moving over to other platforms. So they changed it for reasons I'm not completely clear on, but that would be a great question if you ever get a hold of Maddie or I can't remember his name. He's going to hit me for forgetting it, but ask the .NET Maui folks. I'm sure they could answer that in more detail, but this is the equivalent to it.
Would it be up to the screen reader to handle different languages, or is that something that you would have to do?
So the question is, would it be up to the screen reader to handle different languages? That's usually up to you. So what happens behind the scenes is the screen reader is simply going, so I mentioned before the automation peers. What's happening is your control is creating an abstraction of each control that that is receiving focus, and that is simply exposing a set of properties, and that is a very dumb process. The screen readers are just reading that and reading it to the user on a straight verbatim process. I don't know of any screen reader that has any kind of automatic translation built into it. That would be an interesting feature for the screen readers to provide, but I don't think anybody has got that built in automatically. So you would be responsible for the localization. I'm not sure I would actually trust the screen readers to do that, because without the context of your application, I'm afraid I'm a little afraid of what some of those would do.
So would you be able to dynamically set that like through a database based on the user's localization?
So the question is, would you be able to dynamically change those based on the user's localization? The answer there is absolutely yes, it is. Because basically what's happening is the UI automation tree is actually completely outside of your application. So whatever you're doing in the application, you've got complete control over that before the UI automation stack even gets a chance to take a look at it. So whatever is being displayed, you've got control on that before anything happens by the UI automation stack. That's actually a very deliberate decision by the automation stack. In the old days, primarily MSAA stack, which is a precursor to UIA, they actually did code injection and modified your application by injecting APIs and things like that. There were incidents where that would cause behavioral change in your application in order to get information out to hand to the screen reader. When this happened, in some rare cases, it caused your application to behave differently, which resulted in, why is the application behave differently when a screen reader is attached? This caused the natural, this is a bug that only manifests when a screen reader is attached, which caused application developers to say, well, I'm not going to prioritize that very highly because it's only impacting this subset of users. This caused people with disabilities to basically not trust any kind of screen reader that caused the functionality of the application to change in any way. So they insisted that the UI automation stack be completely separate from the application itself. So any localization that you're doing is always going to be completely independent of the screen reader. So yes, you can change the strings, you can modify any of those values and everything like that as if the screen reader wasn't present. Because as far as the screen reader is concerned, it isn't there. So yes, you can do whatever you like. So I encourage you, give the integrated checker a try on your application. See how many issues it comes up with and take a look to see how hard they are to fix. Realistically, most applications have got, I'll tell you, with Visual Studio, most of the applications, there are 5 or 6 errors, sometimes maybe 8 or 9, that you'll see a lot of instances of a few errors. And then fixing those, once you figure out how to fix them, it's a case of, okay, add an automation property here, add an automation property here, add some names here or there, update a class here or there, and so on. And then for the most part, once you figure out how to fix those, you'll find that the quality of your accessibility will go up substantially just based on fixing those issues. And that goes a fairly long distance towards making your application more accessible. It's not going to fix everything. It's not going to make you immediately compliant there. As I mentioned, there are a lot of things that Accessibility Insights can't fix. But you may be surprised just how much of a jump that gives you. And if you've got some screen reader users out there, try making some of those changes and see what they have to say. They may let you know, wow, this made a really big difference and really improved. And that first step, make those jumps and see what kind of improvements it makes on your product, and then start going from there. Start building that and see what kind of changes it makes for you. So I realize that this is VS Live and there wasn't a whole lot of Visual Studio demos here, but a lot of what I wanted to convey here was, Visual Studio has been on this journey now for 8 years and we're still learning new things. The web content guidelines are changing. They're making they're learning new things. The next round of guidelines are being published and refined as we speak. They're making new improvements in terms of cognitive load and new improvements for the neurodivergence, that we're learning new ways to make things better. They actually had one guideline that they are backpedaling on because they realize that while it makes things better for some folks, it doesn't actually make things better for other folks. And they want to make guidelines that are making the world better for everybody. The laws are changing in different places, and in general, there's a lot of learning that we're doing here. But at the end of the day, talking to your community, talking to the people who have got disabilities is really the best option that we've got. And like I said, it makes the product better, and your customers are going to appreciate it. They're going to appreciate you for it. And in a lot of places, there are small things that you can do for it. So we've still got about 10 more minutes here. If there are folks who've got other questions, I'm happy to open it up and I'd love to know what folks are thinking. Yeah. Great question. Who determines if your app is compliant? So for Visual Studio, we use third-party vendors to do evaluations of whether or not our product is compliant. We test the product every 6 months. We do a comprehensive test of Visual Studio, and then any new features that we release, we put them through third-party evaluations. And then we release what's called a VPAT, which is a voluntary product application template, which basically says these are all the issues that we know, and we release that to the public. At that point, we declare that we are compliant. And we say, to the best of our knowledge, we are compliant. If anybody identifies somewhere where we are not compliant and they let us know, the service agreement that we have with the public is that we'll address it within 60 days. And then basically, if somebody finds something, we fix it within 2 months and release an update accordingly thereafter. So effectively, we self-disclose. And we do the best that we can. And if somebody lets us know somewhere where we're not, we address it appropriately. There is no Uber body out there that does evaluations and says, yes, you are, no, you're not. And generally, the guidance that we usually give is you're going to find out you're not when somebody files a lawsuit. But in most of the, now, please take this caveat with I am not a lawyer. I don't want to be a lawyer or anything like that. But the lawsuits that I have generally seen and looked at usually come at the tail end of person X notified company Y of an accessibility issue. Company Y said, we don't care, lawsuit X was filed. So in most cases, it's been a company was notified of an accessibility issue and did nothing to respond to it. So in most cases, companies are trying to be as accessible as they are when they're notified about it. They respond to it or don't respond to it, and the lawsuit usually comes at the end of, we tried to let them know and they didn't do anything about it. So the recommendation is try to be as accessible as you can, and when somebody lets you know, try to be responsive to it. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, over here. The question is, can we talk about the feature that helps some neurodiverse users but doesn't help others? So the one in question, it had to, I'm trying to remember the specifics of it, but it had to do with focus. And the issue in question, I'm trying to remember. So I may be getting myself a little bit mixed up because I remember we did a user study in Visual Studio. I'm getting ahead of myself because actually now my brain is locked onto a different one. So I won't answer the question that you're specifically asking, but I'll give a kind of an anecdotal one, a different one. We did a user study on Visual Studio of a focus mode feature that we were working on that allowed the user to kind of get rid of some distractions and increased and decreased spacing with focus mode. And we had two neurodivergent developers. One of them said he absolutely loved it. Another one said he absolutely hated it. One of them said it was too spaced out and he found his eyes just drifting all over the screen. The other user said it reduced the crowding and made him feel more relaxed. So that one in particular, we had two neurodivergent users, both of them identified as ADHD. One loved it and one of them absolutely hated it. I'm trying to remember I'd have to look at it. It was one of the WCAG 2.2 requirements, and now I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but I want to say it had to do with passwords because one of the requirements had to do with cognitive testing. So one of the requirements said that you can't require a cognitive test to a user for password or user authentication. And the way it was originally written, you can't require a user to remember their own password, which for obvious reasons was a bit of an issue. The way they eventually resolved it, and I don't know if this is still in there or if they removed it, but it basically said, as long as you have a link that allows the user to reset their password, that actually meets the criteria. Because if I forget my password, but I can still click a link, go to my email, reset the password without having to remember what my old password was and go through the steps, that makes it so I can actually log in without ever having to remember my password. And that met the criteria. So technically based on that, I can actually live my life without ever having to remember a password ever. But as long as I've got my email, access to my personal email, it's a roundabout way of mocking up two-factor authentication. And that was approved by, and that's okay.
Their email must not be compliant. I was going to say, what about their email?
There are sometimes I don't necessarily understand all the pieces of it, but if you think about it, okay, my phone, it's okay, sure, but yeah, another question. The question is this tool customizable? As of right now, no, it's not. It does a full test on all of the accessibility rules that it knows. The reason for that right now is it scans for all of the WCAG AA rules. Let me explain what that means. The WCAG rules are broken up between A AA and AAA rules, and those are based on the impact that it's going to have on the user. You can go into the WCAG guidelines and say what those means, but the AAA are basically what they consider they're nice to have, where A is something that will literally halt a user in their tracks and would not be able to make progress past it. This will check for the A and the AA grade. It will, I believe, not check for the AAA, which most of the EN 301 and United States Section 508, those only care about the A and the AA. So this was specifically set to go to the level that would allow you to meet the laws in the United States and the European Union. If you feel like you want a finer grain of control on it, and that feedback through developer community, and that's something we can look into. And again, we're looking for people to use it and let us know how we can improve how we can make it more useful. We haven't had a lot of requests for that, but if we get those requests, we'll make those modifications. Any other questions? We've just got a few more minutes. All right, if there's nothing else, my Twitter is at Dante Gagne, and the materials for this one are not currently available, but I'm working on getting those available up on the Visual Studio Live webpage. I do want to make them available because I do have the link for the WCAG guidelines. They're not that hard to find or anything like that. But again, I do hope folks get a chance to start thinking about some of these things. And I do want to encourage folks, reach out to me on Twitter if you've got questions about this. This is something you want to explore further. This is a community, honestly, like I've been working in this for 8 years, but over the last year to year and a half, the number of companies, the number of folks who have been exploring this space has just gotten a lot larger. At the Build conference this year, the talk that I did on accessibility was one of the largest ones I've ever had the opportunity to present. People are really getting into this space. It's reaching out, and a lot more folks are wanting tools like this. I want to hear from folks, how can we build more tools? What are y'all looking for in Visual Studio, in VS Code, in our communities and things like that to help you on this journey? Because we want Visual Studio. We're still continuing to do more things to make VS and VS Code the most accessible tools they can be. But we want to help you be successful in making accessible applications. We want you to be able to deliver accessible tools to your customers. And this is just our first step. This is one of the first things we put in VS. And we want to know, is this useful to you? How can we make it more useful? And I want to hear from you. So like I said, the deck for this will be available. My contact information on Twitter is available. My alias at Microsoft is Dante G at Microsoft. Please reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you more. I will also be around at lunch at the, whatever the skills lunch or whatever it's going to be. I'd love to chat with folks further when I can speak properly. And beyond that, folks, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.